War in Ukraine, war in the Middle East, and severe hurricanes in the US. The final weeks of Joe Biden's administration are intense, and they are giving Europe a taste of what it means to stand alone. The planned visit of the US president to Germany, including a major conference on Ukraine, is now canceled. It is becoming increasingly clear America first is also the mantra for Democrats. What does this mean for European allies? As a third winter of war in Ukraine looms, how much protection against Putin can the West still provide? On To the Point, we ask, a world in crisis, can Europe cope without the US? Welcome to this week's To the Point. I'm Javier Arguedas. It's good to have you with us. Let's meet today's guests. Sudha David-Wilp is the director of the Berlin office of the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Marco Overhaus is a senior associate at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, specialized in transatlantic relations. And Goncharenko is my DW colleague from Ukraine, currently working with DW's Russian service. He joins us from the city of Bonn. To all of you, welcome. Thank you for being here with us today. Marco, I'd like to start with you. How was Joe Biden's sudden change of plans perceived here in Europe? It was a very important trip.
It was indeed an important trip. I think there was a lot of regrets, of course, in Berlin and also I guess, in Ukraine, because this was supposed to be a very important trip with the Rammstein meeting taking place in Germany, the first of this kind on this high level at a crucial point of time in Ukraine's fight against Russia. So yes, it was. But at the same time, I would say most German commentators understood well that given this situation with the hurricane happening so closely before the U.S. election, that the domestic politics is more important to any American president, and so I think there has been a lot of understanding for this decision.
Sudha, what does this all tell us about the domestic situation in the United States? With so much at stake, can a president even afford a trip abroad before the end of his presidency in the case of Joe Biden?
So I think policymakers all across Europe are understanding that domestic policy and the polarization in the United States is having a profound effect on U.S. foreign policy. The hurricane is one example now, but less than a month away, I think most people understand that it would be very difficult to justify that the president would go away with such a major hurricane that is coursing through Florida right now. But in April, we also saw the same thing when it took a very long time for Congress to pass a package for Ukraine, and that was all about domestic politics.
It's a sign that the priorities are very clear. Roman, of course, this week, as we just mentioned, should have also seen that very crucial international conference on Ukraine. What reactions have you collected back home?
Well, of course, Ukraine was very unhappy that the meeting was postponed. We should say it is postponed, and I think it will take place maybe some days, some weeks later. But Ukraine needs it urgently, because President Zelensky, just for the background, has met President Biden just a few weeks ago in New York during the UN General Assembly session, and he presented the US administration his, what he calls a victory plan. We still don't know what's inside. There are some leaks. For example, Ukraine, there are two basic points. Ukraine says we are ready to negotiate with Russia, but before, not before we become stronger again. So at the moment, Ukraine is still losing ground, and Russia is occupying more and more Ukrainian territory. So Ukraine needs more weapons, stronger weapons, long strike capabilities. And Ukrainians need more security guarantees, more that we've seen before. For example, at the NATO summit in July in Washington. So Ukraine would like to be sure that when it goes into negotiations with Russia, that Russia will not continue this war in a year or two. So this was supposed to be discussed in Rammstein, and Zelensky said that he would like to start implementing his plan in October. So now this moves to probably November, after the US elections. This is not good for Ukraine, but I would say it is not critical. Of course, in Kiev they understand if Trump becomes president, things will be different. And how different, we don't know at the moment.
We'll definitely dig deeper into the situation for Ukraine. The question is, what's going to happen with the help and who's going to lead that help? America is back. Those were Joe Biden's words when he took office 4 years ago. He was referring to the global stage after Trump's isolationist policies. But what does Biden's policy, or foreign policy rather, really look like, and where will his priorities lie in the coming months?
A hasty and poorly managed withdrawal from Afghanistan marked the beginning of Biden's foreign policy. Now, the Taliban have retaken power and the USA has lost its grip on the region. The Middle East also remains a powder keg. Joe Biden has failed to broker a sustainable peace in the region during his presidency. As a result, his security staff say that Biden's top priority during his final months in office will be to secure a ceasefire between Israel, Hamas, and Hezbollah. By contrast, analysts regard Biden's efforts to build a coalition in support of Ukraine as his greatest foreign policy achievement. Biden is widely considered to be the last transatlantic-oriented U.S. president. His potential successors are more likely to focus on the Pacific and China, the new main rival. Will the USA still be a reliable partner for Germany and Europe in the future?
That's a question many are posing here in Europe. Sudha, what do you make of Biden's foreign policy? Did it strengthen the perception of America as a force for good, as it was promised?
I mean, certainly when Biden came into office, he restored American credibility all around the world vis-a-vis the allies. I think his main objective was to regain trust, and he said America is back. And the perfect example of that is how he was able to corral allies to work together to help Ukraine with Russia's full-scale invasion. Now, the question is whether this momentum will last. And Vice President Harris has said that she believes in liberal internationalism and a rules-based international order. But, of course, the pacing challenge for the United States is China right now. President Trump would probably think differently. He likes to think of his achievements in terms of short-term successes, and he looks at the world transactionally. And he is also risk-averse when it comes to conflict. I mean, he says now on the campaign trail that when he was in office, there was no conflict in the Middle East, for example, and in Europe. So I think it would be, for him, he would look for a quick win when it comes to ceasefires, both in the Middle East and in Ukraine. But that may, of course, not be to the benefit of Ukraine.
Because we have heard in the campaign trail very often that the world was a safer place when Trump was president. That's right. An argument that they're still making. Right,
correct. I mean, that's something that they're touting, and the whole campaign is about trying to reminisce about how good everything was when he was in the White House, albeit, of course, the COVID crisis, and that they readily admit that that's when things turned south for the Trump administration.
Marco, when we take a look at the NATO support specifically, European NATO countries have seen, of course, solid support from the U.S. However, Donald Trump's many complaints about the alliance have been addressed, actually, especially when it comes to financing. Is Europe more or less dependent on the U.S. than 4 years ago, would you say?
I would say Europe is as dependent as it was before, maybe even a little bit more so, simply because the European security landscape has dramatically deteriorated. And we have done a lot in Germany and in other European NATO states to take into consideration this new unsecurity in Europe, but it's still lagging behind what is needed. But the one point I also wanted to make, I think it's especially from Berlin's perspective and other European capitals' perspective, it's very crucial to keep in mind that the United States is looking onto the world differently, I mean, than we do. Whereas for us, Ukraine is really center stage. For the United States, as Sudha said, it's not. It's about China. And imagine how the world changed from a US perspective. I mean, 30 years ago, in the mid-1990s, it was still sufficient for the United States to deploy an aircraft carrier into the Taiwan Strait in order to intimidate Beijing, and that's not possible anymore. And Iran would not have dared to attack Israel directly 20 years ago. In 2017, North Korea for the first time tested an intercontinental ballistic missile, which could directly threaten to the United States. So globally, in this whole situation, Europe, Ukraine is not on the top place of any priority list of a US president, even if it will be Harris in the future.
But are all those developments that you just mentioned a sign that the US did not proceed correctly when it comes to foreign policy?
Well, I'm sure the United States, with this power goes responsibility. So the US has made mistakes, I'm sure, but it's not the cause of the United States that these developments happened. It's just that other countries, usually non-democracies, find ways to challenge US primacy, which was the hallmark of the 1990s, and find ways to roll back American influence, including using force. And so it's not the fault of the US per se, but it's just a more insecure world.
Roll back US influence. Roman, Ukraine, of course, has relied on the US and continues to do so. It wants more support for the war, but it's also seeking more independence for making military decisions. Do you think Ukraine also wants more self-reliance?
Well, sure. Ukraine is very much dependent on the help from the United States. Just to remind you, it was the Biden administration that was very unusually warned just months before and weeks before this invasion that it's coming, and helped, of course, in the first months, and still is number one when it comes to military help. And European allies or partners of Ukraine cannot replace that because they just don't have the weapons, they don't have the missiles, only the United States have. But on the other hand, there is a feeling of, off the record, there is a certain feeling of frustration, growing frustration with the Biden administration because of the red lines. So Ukraine needs those longer strike capabilities to hit targets deep inside Russia with Western weapons, not just the US, but also British and French missiles. And so far, the answer from Biden administration was no. Just a very short no. And there were hopes that maybe in Ramstein, during this meeting, high-level meeting, we will hear a change of that position and maybe a change in the position of Ukraine accelerated NATO membership. That is why the stakes are so high at the moment for Ukraine, with Ukraine losing ground in the east, in Donbass. But there is kind of a stalemate because everybody is looking at the 5th of November, at the presidential elections in the United States, and things are not moving as fast as Ukraine would like them to.
We have to take a look at the 5th of November at the US elections. I know it's difficult, Marco, but we have to look into that race. There's a lot of uncertainty about Kamala Harris's role as commander-in-chief if she wins the race. Do you see a continuation of Biden's foreign policy if Harris wins?
Well, there would definitely be more continuation under her administration as compared to a possible Trump 2 administration. But yeah, I see a lot of potential for continuity with regard to Ukraine. I mean, she has already expressed that she wants to support Ukraine, quote, as long as it takes. But again, I mean, she's not even though a president, U.S. president, is very powerful, he cannot act at free will. I mean, especially if you look at the situation in the U.S. Congress over the last, 5 consecutive Ukraine support packages that passed Congress. At least I sensed a certain erosion of congressional support for Ukraine aid, for sure in the Republican Party. And that is a situation, I think, that also a Harris-Walz administration will face, of course, also depending on the outcome of the congressional elections, which will also take place on November 5th. But the domestic context matters, but in a lot of ways, yeah, she will try at least to, follow this internationalist, relatively pro-Atlanticist path that Biden had already during his term.
And what about the red lines that Roman just mentioned?
With regard to Ukraine and the war, yeah, I mean, these lines don't change. I mean, that's clear that the United States do not want to become directly involved in any direct military conflict with Russia. The red lines that Biden has defined, I don't see any sign that Harris would, step over these lines because there is no domestic support whatsoever for such a policy. But at least I would see, a presidential initiative to continue to support Ukraine against, as I see it, a rising domestic tide of reluctance.
And that reluctance comes primarily from the Republican Party. As we know, Sudha, there's even more uncertainty if Donald Trump becomes the next president. Should Europe brace for a 180 from Biden's, let's say, advocacy for transatlantic relationship?
If Trump were to return to the office, certainly the transatlantic relationship would probably face political headwinds if Trump were to return to office. And I think Europe is fully cognizant of this reality. And the issue is that Europe is hard-pressed with political leadership at the moment. The polarization, some of the same trends that we see in the United States is occurring across Europe as well. And I think it's a matter of who will lead and who will bring the countries together to boost European defense capabilities. And if I just could add that, I think we have to remember that since Obama actually ran for office, the United States has been trying to get out of these forever wars. And the United States, both Republicans and Democrats, are trying to walk this, create a balance between responsibility when it comes to U.S. foreign policy, but also restraint. So the Republicans, of course, have been maybe trending towards isolationism, but at the same time, I think that also Democrats are also going to ask questions twice about escalation. And I think Marco's right that when it comes to Ukraine, support, but there will be red lines because the U.S. doesn't want to get involved in an open conflict with Russia.
And we'll take a closer look at what that all means for Ukraine. The conference of the Ukraine Contact Group, which was to take place in the German city of Ramstein, as we mentioned, has now been postponed. And that, of course, carries consequences. Time is once again running out for Ukraine as its forces are increasingly under pressure.
Things are not going well for Ukraine right now. The military offensive in the Russian province of Kursk has come to a standstill, while Russia continues to advance on the front lines of the Donbas region. Ukraine recently lost a strategically important junction when the Russian army captured the city of Vuhledar, which was where important supply lines for the Ukrainian army intersected. Ukrainian President Zelensky is increasingly calling for authorization to attack the Russian army with long-range Western weapon systems deep in the hinterland. However, military analysts question if this will bring about a lasting shift in the war. Russia's access to soldiers and firepower is simply too great, and there isn't enough Western support for Ukraine to force Russia to negotiate. Even Zelensky's so-called victory plan hasn't received much approval in the USA so far. Does the USA have a plan to save the beleaguered Ukraine?
Roman, how dire is the situation in the front lines? You already mentioned at the beginning of the show that it's not looking good. We've heard, or we read in the headlines that it's a decisive moment, but we've heard and read that many times before.
Well, it is dire, and it is getting worse. We've seen in the past weeks that the Russians could occupy one more important city, Vuhledar, that in the city of Toretsk. Those are used to be very densely populated areas in the east of Ukraine, and they are moving, and the Ukrainians cannot hold the line. So the pressure is growing on the Ukrainian forces. Ukraine tried to distract or to change the narrative in August by that incursion in the Russian Kursk region, but it can still hold the positions there. But it is no substitute for what is happening in Donbas. So basically what it's all about, Ukraine needs, and this is what we hear from some military analysts in the West, Ukraine needs to replay that counteroffensive in 2023 before starting to talk with Russia, starting the negotiations. And for that, it needs those long-range capabilities, but much more actually. It needs much more weapons, and it needs sustainable deliveries, because President Zelensky has been criticizing the West that equipment that has been promised is coming not in the numbers and not at the speed that was promised. So this has to be resolved at Ramstein. And that is why Ukraine was so eager to talk about those issues on the 12th of October. But now this will happen later.
This will happen later, and with the talks, maybe there's also more talk about those plans. We could call it victory plan, we could call it peace plan. Marco, do you see that there's a time, or the time has come to actually sit down and negotiate? Is that really a realistic scenario right now?
Well, definitely not before the U.S. elections. I don't think that, I mean, without the United States, any effort to come to a political solution I don't see that possible. I mean, at least you would have to have a proactive U.S. position on how this would go, so not before the elections. And afterwards, I mean, I share this assessment that many military analysts have at the moment, that now at this point Russia sees itself on the winning side. It's gaining ground, so I don't really see, I mean, Putin hasn't shown any interest in serious negotiations before, so why should he now at the moment? And I am very sympathetic to this idea that providing Ukraine with long-range strike capabilities could make at least some impact on the cost calculus of the Kremlin. So, and I wouldn't really reject the idea, or I think it's possible that after the U.S. elections, and especially if it's not Trump who wins, that the U.S. might relax these restrictions, and then other European allies might follow.
However, time still goes by. Sudha, where do you see the role of the United States in the next coming months ahead of the election? Will Europe really have to fight it off alone?
Well, I think there's an understanding that Europe needs to have more agency, and that Europe has to be able to take care of its security needs in its immediate neighborhood. That's understood. You know, here in Germany, the phrase Zeitenwende has called for this, you know, sort of capability on the part of Germany to stand up militarily to protect its democracy and its partners' security and prosperity, but of course in concert with the United States. And I think that's the hope. I think the hope is that Europe and the United States can stand together to face the various geopolitical challenges at the moment, and certainly the ones that are to come. But for that to happen, I think there's an expectation that Europe needs to be stronger in order to be a formidable partner in the transatlantic relationship.
Some would even argue, Marco, that the fact that the U.S. has shifted its priorities, if you will, has actually brought cohesion to at least the European Union and European allies. Do you agree with that?
Unfortunately, I do not really agree with this. I mean, I see in these times, you know, with all these geopolitical challenges in our immediate European neighborhood, and with this prospect of a second Trump administration, I mean, if this is not the time for more European cohesion, then when? And if you look at the major topics, I mean, Ukraine is probably the one topic where you still have most cohesion in Europe, but in other topics, in other areas, including the Middle East, and including how to deal with China, there's a lot of conflict also in the European Union and among member states, and that is really a pity, because it's really difficult if we have elections every 4 years in the United States, and every time we as Europeans stand there and watch like a snake, like the Kaninchen vor der Schlange, how do you say that in English? Like a rabbit before the snake. How will the election outcome be? And I think, we need more unity in Europe, but it seems to be very difficult to achieve that if it's not even possible now.
With a possible scenario of a European, arguing and a Trump administration, Roman, do you think Ukraine has a plan for, say, a Trump administration and a divided Europe?
Well, of course, Ukraine have seen that Trump could become president again. Ukraine has some experience with President Trump. It was not a very good experience, but on the other hand, let's remember, it was Trump who gave Ukraine those anti-tank anti-tank weapons that the Obama administration was not willing to give. So Ukraine is trying to establish a connection also to Trump. President Zelensky has met him in New York, and it is seen in Kiev as a success for Ukrainian diplomacy. But on the other hand, Trump is still making some remarks which can be understood as anti-Ukrainian. So he's even using that argument now during the hurricane, saying that the Biden administration is giving so much money to Ukraine and not enough money to help the victims of that hurricane, of those hurricanes, because there are several. So things are very dynamic at the moment, and of course Ukraine is worried what will happen after Trump. But on the other hand, Ukraine had time to prepare.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Roman, thank you so much to all three of you for this fruitful discussion. Thank you for watching. Of course, we'll see you next week and at any time on our YouTube channel. Just look for DW News, where we'll find all to-the-point programs. Till next time, take care and goodbye.